everyone thinks they know this story, but almost everything you've heard is missing context, edited clips, silent press rooms, whispered restrictions, and an online narrative that took on a life of its own. Stay with me, because once you see how this really unfolded, you'll understand why certain questions were never asked and why the truth was quietly buried in plain sight. He woke up thinking about how strange it is that certain stories never really disappear, they just go quiet for a while, waiting for the right moment to resurface louder, sharper, and more distorted than before. And that is exactly what has been happening lately, because suddenly conversations that were buried years ago are being dragged back into the spotlight and reframed in ways that feel unfamiliar even to the people who lived them. And this is why I want you to stay with me all the way through this, because the truth here is layered and uncomfortable, and it reveals far more about how Hollywood actually works than any headline ever could. And it starts with a moment that sounds shocking on purpose, because shock travels faster than context and outrage spreads faster than facts. And when people hear a claim repeated often enough, they stop asking whether it makes sense and start reacting emotionally, and that emotional reaction is exactly what keeps misinformation alive and profitable. And what makes this even more unsettling is how quickly authority is assigned to whoever speaks the loudest, especially online, where confidence is often mistaken for credibility, and speculation is packaged as insight, and suddenly a narrative is born not because it is true, but because it is dramatic and easy to consume. And once that happens, anyone who challenges it becomes the villain, and anyone who asks for proof is accused of protecting power. And this is how nuance dies in real time, and this is the environment we are dealing with right now. And to understand why this matters, you need to understand the rules that quietly govern this industry, rules that are never written down, but everyone learns very quickly. And the first rule is that hierarchy is everything. And once someone is positioned at the top, the expectation is not just respect, but silence from everyone below them. And this silence is enforced not through contracts alone, but through fear of losing access, fear of being labeled difficult, fear of being quietly removed from future opportunities. And that fear shapes behavior in ways that most audiences never see, because what appears on screen is polished and cheerful, while what happens behind the scenes is often complicated, tense, and carefully managed. And this is why when someone finally speaks openly about a negative experience, it feels jarring, not because it is rare, but because it is usually hidden. And when a comedian recently described what it was like working with a co-star and talked about how people were treated on set, the backlash was immediate and intense and telling, because instead of focusing on the behavior being described, the conversation shifted to tone and delivery and whether he had the right to speak at all. And that reaction alone says more than any quote ever could, because it reinforces the idea that honesty is acceptable only when it flatters, and that criticism, even when framed as personal experience, is seen as betrayal. And what made this moment resonate is that he did not retreat when criticized. He explained why people stay quiet and how the industry rewards those who play along and punishes those who do not. And this is not speculation, it is a pattern many have experienced privately and acknowledged quietly, but rarely discussed publicly, because survival in this business often depends on being agreeable rather than truthful. And as this discussion gained traction, it collided with another unresolved thread, one that many people had noticed but few had been able to explain, which was the strange absence of certain topics during a major press tour, and the way questions seemed carefully steered away from obvious points of discussion. And at first this was brushed off as coincidence or strategy. But when journalists from different regions began comparing experiences, a clearer picture started to emerge, and it was not about one person or one interview, but about a system designed to control narrative flow at all costs. And what makes this particularly troubling is how subtle these controls can be, because they are not always presented as firm rules, but as last-minute suggestions, quiet reminders, or whispered warnings delivered seconds before a camera starts rolling. And in those moments, journalists are placed in an impossible position, because refusing can mean losing access not just to one interview, but to an entire ecosystem of future opportunities. And this pressure disproportionately affects freelancers and international press, who do not have the backing of large institutions, and this imbalance is rarely acknowledged publicly, even though it shapes coverage in very real ways. And when one respected outlet finally confirmed that they were advised to avoid certain topics altogether, it validated what many had suspected, and it raised serious questions about where publicity ends and journalistic integrity begins, and why stories that are central to a project are suddenly deemed inappropriate to discuss. And this vacuum of honest conversation creates fertile ground For speculation, because when official channels go quiet, unofficial ones grow louder. And that is where things begin to spiral, because into that silence step individuals who claim exclusive insight and hidden knowledge, and they often present themselves with impressive titles and confident delivery, and for many viewers that is enough, because authority feels reassuring even when it is unverified. And soon edited clips begin circulating stripped of context and reframed to support pre-existing conclusions. And each repetition makes the story feel more real even as it drifts further from reality. And challenging these narratives becomes increasingly difficult, because doing so requires patience, evidence, and a willingness to sit with complexity, which does not perform well online. And this is why the most extreme interpretations often rise to the top, because they are simple, emotionally charged, and easy to share, and what gets lost in the process is the actual lived experience of the people involved and the broader systemic issues that deserve attention. And instead of discussing power dynamics, media control, and professional boundaries, the conversation devolves into spectacle and character assassination, and this benefits no one except those profiting from attention. And what is most concerning is how quickly audiences are encouraged to abandon critical thinking in favor of allegiance to whoever tells the most compelling story. And once that happens, the truth becomes secondary to engagement, and facts are treated as optional. And this is not just a problem for celebrities or journalists. It is a problem for anyone who cares about accountability. Because when misinformation dominates the discourse, real issues are buried and real harm is minimized, and the cycle repeats louder each time. And that is why it is so important to slow down, question sources, and resist the urge to accept dramatic claims at face value, no matter how confidently they are delivered, because the real story here is not nearly as sensational, but it is far more revealing. And it forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about silence, power, and the cost of speaking honestly in an industry built on image and illusion. What makes this situation even more unsettling is how easily memory can be rewritten when enough time has passed, because when years go by, details blur, context fades, and suddenly a heavily edited clip becomes the entire story. And that is exactly how certain moments resurface, stripped of everything surrounding them and presented as if they exist in a vacuum. And when people encounter these clips for the first time, they assume they are seeing the full interaction, when in reality they are seeing a fragment carefully chosen because it provokes a reaction. And reactions are what drive engagement, and once that reaction takes hold, it becomes nearly impossible to reverse, because correcting misinformation rarely travels as far as the original claim. And this is where the danger lies, because narratives built on partial truths can feel convincing even when they collapse under scrutiny, and yet scrutiny requires time, patience, and willingness to listen, which are not qualities rewarded in fast-paced online spaces. And this is why the loudest interpretations often win, not because they are accurate, but because they are simple and emotionally charged. And what often goes unnoticed is how these interpretations conveniently align with existing biases and expectations, making them feel familiar and therefore believable. And when someone with a large following presents speculation as insight, many viewers assume due diligence has already been done, when in fact no evidence has been provided at all. And questioning that authority is framed as hostility rather than responsibility. And this discourages healthy skepticism and replaces it with blind trust. And that shift has serious consequences, especially when the subject matter involves professional boundaries, media ethics, and personal reputation. Because once a claim is repeated often enough, it stops being perceived as a claim and starts being treated as fact, even if no source has ever confirmed it. And anyone who pushes back is accused of denial or protection, and this creates a chilling effect where nuance is treated as weakness and certainty is rewarded regardless of accuracy. And this environment does not foster truth, it fosters performance, and those who perform outrage most effectively rise to the top, while those who ask careful questions are drowned out. And what makes this particularly frustrating is that the reality is already compelling without exaggeration, because the real issue here is not a single interaction or a single interview, but a system that prioritizes image over transparency and control over conversation. And that system relies on silence to function. And when silence is broken, the response is rarely introspection. It is defensiveness and deflection, and we have seen this pattern repeat across industries, not just entertainment, where those who speak about negative experiences are immediately scrutinized for tone, timing, and motive, while the behavior itself is rarely examined with the same intensity. And this imbalance discourages honesty and rewards compliance, and over time it creates an illusion of harmony that only exists because dissent has been suppressed. And when that illusion cracks, it can feel shocking to audiences who were never meant to see behind the curtain. And that shock often turns into anger not at the system but at whoever pulled the curtain back. And this is why whistleblowers, critics, and outspoken voices are so often reframed as troublemakers rather than contributors to accountability. And this reframing is incredibly effective because it shifts focus away from structural issues and onto individual personalities, turning complex conversations into personal disputes, and that simplification benefits those in power because it prevents deeper examination of how access is granted, how narratives are shaped, and how press relationships are managed. And one of the most revealing aspects of this entire situation is how normalized last-minute restrictions have become. Because when journalists describe being warned seconds before an interview about topics to avoid, it highlights a power imbalance that most viewers never consider, and these warnings are not issued with contracts or written agreements precisely because they are meant to be deniable and difficult to prove, and this gray area allows publicists to exert control while maintaining plausible deniability, and journalists are left weighing the cost of compliance against the cost of refusal. And for many, especially freelancers, refusal is not a realistic option because their livelihood depends on continued access. And this reality is rarely acknowledged by audiences who assume that silence equals agreement rather than survival. And when a major outlet finally confirms these practices, it validates what many have experienced quietly, and it raises serious questions about the integrity of promotional cycles and the extent to which coverage is shaped before questions are even asked. And this controlled environment creates a vacuum where honest discussion is replaced by curated talking points, and when those talking points avoid central themes, it becomes clear that the goal is not conversation but containment. And when containment fails, the response is often to discredit anyone who challenges the narrative. And this is where conspiracy-driven accounts thrive, because they position themselves as truth-tellers fighting a hidden system even when their claims lack evidence. And this framing is seductive because it appeals to a sense of insider knowledge and moral clarity. And followers are encouraged to trust the messenger rather than verify the message. And this dynamic is particularly dangerous when credentials are used as shields, because titles can create an illusion of authority even when the content presented does not meet basic standards of verification. And when asked for sources, these accounts often deflect or dismiss the question, implying that skepticism itself is part of the problem. And this tactic effectively shuts down critical inquiry and replaces it with loyalty tests, where belief becomes more important than truth. And what is most concerning is how quickly serious topics are invoked without care for accuracy or impact, because invoking extreme claims generates attention regardless of whether they can be substantiated. And once those claims are in circulation, they take on a life of their own, spreading across platforms detached from their origin. And by the time they are challenged, the damage is already done, and reputations have been shaped by impressions rather than facts. And this cycle benefits no one except those monetizing outrage, and it distracts from meaningful conversations about professionalism, ethics, and accountability. And instead of asking how systems can improve, audiences are encouraged to pick sides and engage in endless debate over distorted narratives. And this exhaustion serves the status quo, because when people are overwhelmed, they disengage, and disengagement allows existing structures to remain unchanged. And this is why it is so important to pause and examine not just what is being said, but how and why, and who benefits from the way the story is framed. Because the truth does not need embellishment, and it does not need conspiracy to be compelling. It simply needs space to be heard, and that space is often the first thing taken away when control becomes the priority. What complicates this even further is the way time is weaponized. Because when something happened years ago, it becomes easier for others to reshape it with confidence, knowing that most people were not there and will never go back to verify the full context. And this allows speculation to masquerade as reconstruction, and memory to be treated as malleable rather than anchored in reality. And once a rewritten version gains traction, it starts to replace the original experience entirely, and that can be deeply unsettling for the people involved, because suddenly they are being told what they supposedly did or intended by strangers who were never in the room. And this disconnect between lived reality and online narrative is one of the most disorienting aspects of modern media culture, because it removes agency from those who were actually present and hands it to whoever controls the loudest platform. And what makes this especially powerful is repetition, because the same claim, repeated across different accounts, begins to feel confirmed, even if all of them trace back to a single unverified source. And when viewers encounter that repetition, They assume independent verification has occurred when in fact it has not, and this illusion of consensus is one of the most effective tools in shaping belief. Because humans are wired to trust what appears widely accepted, and once that trust is established, it becomes emotionally uncomfortable to question it, and this discomfort is often misinterpreted as evidence that the claim must be true. Because why else would it feel so unsettling to doubt it? And this psychological loop keeps people locked into narratives, even when cracks begin to show, and those cracks often appear when basic questions are asked, such as where's the full clip, where's the source, where's the corroboration, and instead of answers, what often follows is deflection, accusations, or appeals to authority. And this response is telling because it reveals that the narrative cannot withstand scrutiny and must therefore rely on belief rather than evidence. And belief is far easier to sustain when framed as moral certainty, because questioning it then feels like wrongdoing, and this framing discourages critical thinking by equating skepticism with harm. And this tactic is not new, but it has become increasingly effective in algorithm-driven spaces, where emotional engagement is rewarded more than accuracy, and this environment incentivizes creators to escalate claims because escalation drives attention, and attention drives growth, and growth drives income. And once that incentive structure is in place, restraint becomes a liability rather than a virtue. And this is how misinformation can spread without malicious intent, because the system itself rewards whatever performs best regardless of truth. And what is lost in this process is the ability to have grounded conversations about power, professionalism, and accountability, because those conversations require nuance, and nuance does not trend well. And yet nuance is where real change begins, because without it everything collapses into extremes, and extremes rarely reflect reality. And this is particularly evident when discussing press dynamics, because audiences often assume interviews are spontaneous and unrestricted, when in reality they are heavily negotiated and influenced by access agreements and unspoken expectations. And this does not mean journalists lack integrity, but it does mean they operate within constraints that are rarely visible to viewers. And when those constraints are acknowledged publicly, it can be uncomfortable, because it challenges the assumption that media coverage is always fully autonomous. And this discomfort sometimes leads audiences to reject the information entirely, rather than grapple with its implications. And that rejection often takes the form of attacking the messenger, rather than examining the message. And this reaction protects the illusion of simplicity, because complexity demands effort, and effort is scarce in fast-paced digital environments. And yet ignoring complexity does not make it disappear. It simply allows it to fester beneath the surface and resurface in more distorted forms later. And this cycle has repeated itself countless times, because the underlying structures remain unchanged. And until there is broader awareness of how narratives are managed, how silence is incentivized, and how misinformation exploits gaps in transparency, these patterns will continue. And one of the most concerning outcomes of this cycle is the erosion of trust, because when audiences realize they have been misled repeatedly, they may begin to distrust everything, including credible reporting. And this creates fertile ground for extreme interpretations, because when all information feels suspect, the most dramatic explanation can feel as valid as any other. And this collapse of discernment benefits those who thrive in chaos, because chaos blurs accountability and allows falsehoods to coexist with facts without clear distinction. And this is why it is so important to reinforce the value of verification, even when it is less exciting, because verification is the foundation of credibility, and without it we are left with noise rather than knowledge. And the irony is that the truth in situations like this is often far more revealing than the exaggerated versions, because it exposes systems rather than individuals, and patterns rather than isolated incidents. And those insights are what can lead to meaningful discussion and potential improvement. But they require patience and willingness to sit with discomfort, and that willingness is something we must actively cultivate, because the digital landscape does not encourage it by default. And if we allow ourselves to be swept along by whatever narrative is trending at the moment, we risk becoming participants in a cycle that prioritizes spectacle over substance and reaction over reflection. And that is not just a media problem, it is a cultural one, and addressing it starts with slowing down, asking questions, and resisting the urge to accept the most sensational version of events simply because it is the loudest and most repeated. And doing so does not mean dismissing concerns or invalidating experiences. It means honoring them by seeking accuracy rather than amplification. And that distinction matters, because accuracy builds understanding, while amplification without verification builds confusion, and confusion ultimately serves those who benefit from distraction rather than accountability. At the end of the day, This story is not about outrage, it is about awareness about how narratives are shaped. Silence is enforced and misinformation spreads when people stop asking questions. The truth does not need drama to survive, it needs context, patience, and critical thinking. So before believing the loudest voice, pause, check the facts, and remember, honesty matters more than hype, because once trust is gone, it is almost impossible to rebuild.